advantage in numbers, failed yet again to defeat little Serbia and ran home with its tail between its legs, 300,000 men fewer. The world fell in love with underdog Serbia and sent money, supplies, and troops, and Italy leaned more and more toward joining the Allies. Number 5, stupid move of the year. Winston Churchill hatches his brilliant plan to break through the Dardanelles, take Constantinople, and knock the Turks out of the war. Now, we all know this was a completely predictable disaster that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Predictable in that it had been accurately predicted by not one, not two, but 3 British Sea Lords, including Winston Churchill himself, within the preceding 10 years. But Churchill's ego really couldn't stand to see the army get all the glory in the war, and he had to get his navy in the fight. One man. Number 4 is also one man, and it might be the man you've all been waiting for. Insert applause noise here, okay? It might be the man you've all been waiting for. Number 4, Austrian Army Chief of Staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf, launches not 1, not 2, but 3 doomed winter offensives against the Russians in the Carpathian Mountains. The real goal of these was to free the garrison of over 100,000 men who were under siege at the fortress of Przemysl. But the offensives were so unplanned, underplanned, poorly planned, whatever you want to call it, that soldiers went off in minus 30-degree snowy mountains in cardboard-soled shoes. Hundreds of thousands froze to death. Many wounded in no man's land were even eaten by wolves, and the total cost in men for these debacles was over 800,000 of the cream of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Number 3 is also a single man's stupidity. Number 3, Gavrilo Princip shoots the one man, Franz Ferdinand, who really could help Serbia achieve its dreams, dooming that country. It's true, while Franz Ferdinand was possibly the most horrible human being in all of Europe, if not the world, he was also a rabid patriot. And even though he detested the Slavic peoples, he believed that the dual empire of Austria-Hungary should become a triple one with the Slavs as the third part. He was heir to the throne. The empire was 84 years old, and while Konrad von Hotzendorf had tried to start war like 30 times in the 2 years before the war actually began, it was Franz Ferdinand who was his counterweight and prevented it. And Princip shot him. See, that was just plain stupid. Number 2 was more of a group effort. After Russia had thoroughly kicked Austria's butt in the winter offensive and was only prevented from vomiting forth onto the Hungarian plain by some timely German reinforcements, the Russian High Command repeatedly ignored intelligence that the Germans were building a force like none seen before, with over 2,000 heavy guns. That was stupid because when the hammer fell on May the 1st and the Gorlice Tarnov offensive kicked off, the Russians lost 8 months of gain in a couple of weeks. Lost Lemberg, lost Przemysl, lost Galicia, and now, 3 months later, are still in retreat with Warsaw, heck, all of Poland, and even Riga and Kovno in danger. The retreat would not only eventually number over 1 million casualties, but it would result in several million refugees. Never ignore your intelligence, Russia. Stupid. But even that was not the single stupidest thing anyone in the war did this past year. And the single stupidest thing was actually done by one single man. Can you guess? Okay, I'll count to 5.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Drum roll, please. And the number 1 stupidest thing done in the first year of the war. Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph declares war on Serbia. Yep, I don't think I even need to explain that. So that's my top 11. Okay, thanks for all the support this past year, and whether you agree with my list or have some other stupid moves which you think were stupider than the ones I chose, tell us in the comments below. And if you haven't already, check us out on Facebook for all the cool stuff our social media guy Florian puts up, and in the meantime, click here to see how Potiorek screwed up at Belgrade. See you next time. Russia had been steadily losing territory for over 3 months now, and 6 weeks ago even lost Lemberg, the capital of Galicia. But this week, it gets even worse. For this week, the Germans take Warsaw. I'm Indy Nidell. This is the Great War. Last week, the war celebrated its first birthday in a previously unheard of manner. On the Western Front, the Germans used flamethrowers effectively for the first time at Hughe. The Armenian genocide continued in eastern Anatolia, and at sea, more ships carrying civilians were torpedoed. On the eastern front, the Russians ended the week retreating along their entire line, as they also evacuated Warsaw and Riga from advancing German armies. And at home in Petrograd, there was a very real fear of what was to become of the army as desertion, surrender, and revolutionary propaganda became epidemic in the field. Italy was on the move, and way away to the south, South Africa annexed the former German colony of Southwest Africa. We're going to look at Russia first today, specifically what was going on in the Polish salient, where the Germans and Austrians had been tightening the noose for weeks. The Russian fortress of Ivangorod, besieged throughout the week from all sides, could hold out no longer and was abandoned. Austrian forces triumphantly entered August 4th. The Russian retreat from Warsaw, which had been nearly surrounded by this time, began the night of August 3rd, though the city had already been stripped of things like medals from church bells and usable machinery. The Germans arrived on August 5th at 6 a.m., and Prince Leopold of Bavaria formally took command of the city. This was an enormous prize. The Russians were without control of the city for the first time in 100 years, and the Germans now set their long-term sights towards Finland, which had belonged to Russia since 1808, when Russia had taken it from Sweden. The fall of Warsaw was a big blow for Russia, and the war was in motion this week on the whole eastern front, and way to the south at Gallipoli, men were trying to get that front into motion again and break the stalemate. This week, British forces would try yet again to break through and launched an attack at Suvla Bay. The goal was to link up with Anzac, Australian and New Zealander, positions further south and finally drive the Turks off the high ground at Chunuk Bair and the even higher Kocachemen Tepe. Now, there were two diversionary attacks planned to draw Turkish forces away from the high ground. The first was above Anzac Cove at Lone Pine, and the Australians managed to penetrate the Turkish lines in a bloodbath. When they consolidated the newly taken trenches, over 1,000 Turkish bodies had to be carried out of them, and there were another 4,000 Turkish casualties. The Australians took only 1,700. The second diversion was at Cape Helles, once again, for the umpteenth time, trying to take the village of Krithia and the heights of Achi Baba. This attack was not as successful as the first, but both of these were successful as diversions, as Australian, New Zealander, Indian, and British troops successfully landed at Suvla Bay, overcame the defenders, crossed the coastal plain, headed towards the hills, and then stopped. See, these men were by now used to Western Front victories of 50 or 100 yards. Now that they had a half mile of unopposed advance in front of them, they didn't really know what to do, so they hesitated and failed to advance. That night, further south, 16,000 Australian troops headed northward from Anzac Cove to take Kocachemen Tepe. Now, at Kocachemen Tepe was Colonel Hans Kanengieser, but he had just gotten there. He had initially gone to Lone Pine with a Turkish division, but since he missed the action there, he headed for the high ground. So he got to see, by the dawn's early light, a huge column of 16,000 Australians advancing 300 yards below. Kanengieser only had 20 men with him, so he ordered them to lie down and open fire. The Australians thought they were facing a much bigger force, so they too lay down and took cover, and by the time the deception was realized, General Lehman von Sanders had arrived at the summit with 2 Ottoman regiments. The Turks held the heights. Further south, a New Zealand battalion had reached the top of Chunuk Bair with no opposition. At the top, they found 1 Turkish machine gun and its sleeping crew. But Turkish troops on spurs on each side of Chunuk Bair, on Hill Q and Battleship Hill, opened fire on the New Zealanders and prevented reinforcements from arriving. And that's how things stood there at the end of the week. A little Gallipoli side note here. On August 1st, the Galata Bridge in Constantinople was blown up by British subs. British technology was certainly improving, but if you look around Europe, it was the Germans whose innovations were the big things. Their U-boats were feared by all shipping. Their poison gas was the terror of troops on the western front, their artillery on the eastern one. They had just begun using flamethrowers successfully, which added yet another element of terror to their arsenal. And now, as of the beginning of August 1915, they ruled the skies as the Fokker Scourge began. The Fokker Eindecker were single-seat fighter planes developed by Dutchman Anthony Fokker. They were not only the first German fighter planes built, they were the first of all planes outfitted with synchronization gear, which allowed the pilot to fire his machine gun through the propeller, so he could aim the gun just by aiming the plane. This was a major innovation. Fokker demonstrated the plane back on May 23rd, and now, as the summer dragged on, with planes in the hands of Oswald Belke and Max Immelmann, Germany unquestionably had the flying advantage. The Allied aviators even soon began to refer to their own planes as Fokker fodder. The Fokker scores also really marked the beginning of the age of the flying aces, and though the Germans enjoyed a tactical advantage, they also had a huge psychological one. By the end of July, there were only around 15 Eindeckers in service, and that number would soon grow. One acute issue that Germany did have that occasionally limited just what could be produced was raw materials. Imports from overseas were of course cut off by the blockade, but way back at the beginning of the war, August 9, 1914, Walter Rathenau, a Jewish businessman, persuaded Erich von Falkenhayn, now German Army Chief of Staff but at that time Minister of War, to establish a raw materials agency. Its first task was to take stock of raw materials not only within Germany, but also in occupied territories, especially Belgium, so they could then be centrally allocated to the companies that could make the best use of them. So, each commodity had its own raw materials company, and that company had a board made up primarily from the companies that used that commodity. So whether or not the agency was successful, there were charges that the free market had been enlisted to serve the government, but with guaranteed profits. Here's the thing. A dramatic expansion of output and a shift to making things as quickly as possible had the big consequence of lowering standards a whole lot. Germany, for example, lost 2,300 field guns and 900 howitzers in 1915 because of premature explosions. That's the same amount that were disabled by enemy action. So expansion had taken over from quality control. Just thought I'd touch on the subject as long as I was talking about German technology. And so another week comes to an end, with the British troops looking surprisingly good at Gallipoli and a mostly quiet Western Front, though Germany took control of the skies. But the Eastern Front was in total upheaval as the Austro-German forces took Ivangorod and Warsaw. But what did that mean for Russia? Well, it was a big deal, but Warsaw had been right near enemy territory since the beginning of the war, so it had always been conceivable that it would fall. But there was something else brewing that, if it happened, would have far greater consequences in Petrograd. The German offensive up in the Baltic was something really scary, for it threatened Kovno, also called Kaunas, which was in Russian Lithuania, and meant more to a Russian patriot than Polish territory did. But more than that, it was one of the strongest and greatest of the Russian fortresses, and held an enormous amount of weapons, ammunition, and all kinds of provisions. Some of the advanced forts had fallen into German hands in July, and by the end of this week, it was under siege. And so we just keep seeing each week that things go worse and worse for the Russians, fighting and dying by the anonymous hundreds of thousands as their territory slips from their grasp. This was modern war. Today we talked about German weapons that seemed to be unstoppable at this point of the war. Especially notorious was the gas used on the Western Front. Now, it was based on the research of one man, Fritz Haber. He played a major role in creating gas warfare, but also won a Nobel Prize after the war. You can find out how all that happened in our special episode about Fritz Haber right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Bernie Stern. Thank you, Bernie. If you want to find out more about supporting the show and get cool perks in return, check out our Patreon page. For more discussions on the show, check out our subreddit. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Hi, I'm Indy Nidell, and this is The Great War. Now, our channel has loads of content already, so this is the 101 to start watching. In our regular episodes, which come out every Thursday, we follow the First World War week by week as it unfolds from beginning to end. If you'd like to see that from the very beginning, you can click right here, or check out the playlist below. If you want to jump ahead, we've also done some recap episodes so you can cheat a little if you're strapped for time. You can check those out right here. If you want some background to the war, we did a 3-part series of Prelude to War specials. You can watch those right here. We also regularly do specials, bio episodes, and a series of question and answers. You can find all of those below. And, as always, if you have any questions or comments, send them in and we'll get back to you. Don't forget to subscribe. See you Thursdays. Milunka Savic was one of the very few women who fought actively in World War I. She fought for the entire war, becoming one of the most decorated, badass women in military history. I'm Indy Indy Nidell. Welcome to another special bio episode of Who Did What in World War I. Today featuring Milunka Savic. From what we can figure out, she was born possibly June 28, 1888 in the Serbian village Koprivnica. Some sources say 1890, but there really aren't any records of her family background or her childhood. We do know that she had a brother, and in fact joined the Serbian military in 1912 in her brother's name. Women were only allowed to work as medical staff at the time and not perform active duty, yet Milunka Savic was ready to see battle, disguised as her brother, Milun Savic. She first fought in the two Balkan Wars, and it was only after she was injured in the second one that it was discovered that she was a woman. She had been part of an infantry regiment known as the Iron Regiment, fought in the Battle of Bregalnica and was promoted to corporal. So, the wounded Savic recovered, and the brass wondered what to do now. They didn't want to punish her for serving her country, but a woman in battle? They called her in, and she said that all she wanted to do was to fight for her country. And after a brief consultation, that's what they let her do. Good thing, too, because a year later, Serbia found itself fighting the First World War and being invaded by nearly 500,000 Austro-Hungarians, again and again and again. It was during the third invasion, in November and December 1914, that the Battle of Kolubara was fought. And though the Serbs were huge underdogs, they not only won, they drove the enemy right out of their country. For her valor in battle, Milunka was awarded the Order of the Star of Karađorđe with swords, the highest honor the Kingdom of Serbia offered. Now, there are stories about her at Kolubara which may well be true, but then again may not be entirely so, but they certainly made her a national hero. She reportedly crossed no man's land alone, throwing grenades, jumped into an Austrian trench, and took 20 soldiers prisoner. 2 years later, at the Battle of Cherna, against the Bulgarians, she managed to clear out a Bulgarian trench and take 23 prisoners again, single-handedly, earning herself the second star of Karađorđe. I apologize for mispronouncing anything. After the battle, the Serbian army retreated to the Albanian coast, marching across the snowy mountains. Milunka was wounded 7 more times during the fighting retreat. By the time they reached the coast, the Serbian army numbered little more than 100,000 men. They were evacuated by the French and British, and Milunka and her unit became a Serbian brigade in the French army. She was injured again in Tunisia, and then went to the front in Salonika, where she fought until 1918, becoming a non-commissioned officer in the process. There's a tale from that period that a French officer refused to believe that a woman could be so capable. So he set up a bottle of 1880 cognac at 40 meters and said if she could hit it, she could have the other 19 bottles in the case. She got it on the first shot. Milunka Savic was repeatedly decorated during the war. She won the French Legion of Honor twice, the Russian Order of the Holy George for Courage, the British Medal of the Order of St. Michael, and France's highest honor, the Croix de Guerre. She was injured a total of 9 times, but fought the war from beginning to end. After the war, she continued to be honored, receiving the Serbian silver and gold medals for her bravery during the Balkan Wars. And the French even asked her to move to Paris and take an army pension. She declined and settled in Belgrade, in a neighborhood that is now named after her. She worked for the post office and then as a janitor at a bank. She married, had a daughter, divorced, and adopted 3 more daughters. During the Second World War, she was sent to concentration camp for 10 months, and after the war lived in poverty and obscurity until the half-century remembrances of the First World War, when she turned up wearing her medals, which was more than anybody else had. The older soldiers talked about her exploits, and she became famous once again in her old age. She suffered a stroke and died in Belgrade, October 5th, 1973. Milunka Savic's story is pretty unique, and her feats truly the stuff of legend. Yet she was forgotten for much of the 20th century. Still, she's remembered today, and there was even a movie a couple years ago and a theatrical play about her. She is now remembered as a Serbian war hero. Apart from the individual stories like Milunka's, the general role of women in World War I is often overlooked. So we made a special episode about that role, and you can check that out right here. I can imagine I'm going to get some good comments about Milunka Savic in the section below, and I look forward to reading them. If you like our show, please subscribe and recommend us to your friends. See you Thursdays. The battle at Gallipoli had been a stalemate for months, but the Allies had landed tens of thousands of troops last week in a fresh attempt to gain the high ground. But what happens when new recruits who've never seen battle take on a battle-hardened enemy? We'll find out in just a minute. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, Warsaw, the capital of Russian Poland, had finally fallen to the German juggernaut after its evacuation. The Germans now had the Russian fortress of Kovno, or Kaunas, under siege in Russian Lithuania. At Gallipoli, the British had made a successful landing at Suvla Bay, but had only advanced a short way across the plain before halting, while New Zealander troops finally held the high ground of Chunuk Bair, and the new synchronization gear developed by Anthony Fokker for the Germans that allowed a machine gun to fire between propeller blades gave the Germans mastery of the skies. That was over on the Western Front at the moment, and I'll take a look there first this week. On August 7th, the Germans attacked in the Argonne and the Bosch, but were knocked back with casualties estimated at around 4,000. Twice more they would try this week to break through in the Argonne, failing both times. Also in the West, Zeppelin raids on the east coast of Britain the 9th and 13th claimed 29 civilian lives. Still, the civilians in Britain had it far better than those in Eastern Europe, many of whom were in full flight, destroying their property and burning their farms as they fled from the German Colossus. The German army that took Warsaw advanced eastward, and the Russian army fell back, leaving as defense the fortress of Novo-Georgievsk with 90,000 men as the garrison. This was where the Vistula and Bug rivers come together, but it didn't slow the German advance at all. They surrounded it and set siege to it, but continued on, leaving 80,000 non-frontline soldiers as the siege troops, and beginning to bring in the big howitzers, the 16-inch guns that had demolished Antwerp last fall. The same commander from that siege, General Hans Hartwig von Bessler. There was a lot of German and Russian action far to the north, as the Germans made moves toward both Riga and Kovno. Twice this week, the German Navy bombarded Riga, but were driven off both times, while on the 7th, near Riga itself, the Russians pushed back the Germans. At Kovno, German artillery began bombarding the forts on the 8th with the great Gamma Gerat howitzer, whose shells weighed a ton and had a range of 14 kilometers. But the Russians fought off several attempts to break through the perimeter, inflicting severe casualties on the Germans. On the 9th, the Germans tried a night attack, but lost a full 3 battalions to the Russian counterattack. Just a side note here, the German artillery bombardment was so fantastic that it could apparently be heard as far away as Vilnius, 100 kilometers away. Even though the Russian counterattacks were effective at the beginning of the week, by the end of it, both Vilnius and Kovno were being evacuated, though the Germans still could not break through. But the artillery was wreaking havoc on the forts defending the fortress. Back at home in Berlin, the Kaiser this week authorized a battalion of 2,000 men that would be entirely Finns to fight against Russia. The recruits were to be smuggled out of Finland, which had loads of Russian police, so everything was done in total secrecy. One other thing that happened this week involving Germany. At the end of the week, Austro-Hungarian and German armies made contact west of Brest-Litovsk. They now formed an unbroken line encircling 3 Russian armies, probably foreshadowing yet another disaster for the Russians. And one of the greatest disasters of the war, Gallipoli, continued this week with fresh attacks. On August 9th, the attack on Koja Cementepe was renewed. British and Gurkha forces actually reached the top and fought off the Turkish counterattack with a bayonet charge. They were even about to drive the Turks down the far side when British naval gunners, unaware of their success, fired upon them and forced them back. The New Zealand forces that had held Chunuk Bair for a couple of days now faced an attack by Turkish forces commanded by Mustafa Kemal. They counterattacked brilliantly and had the Turks in disarray. Kemal's staff wanted to retreat, but the recently promoted Kemal, now a colonel and awarded the Iron Cross First Class by the Germans, said this: "Don't rush it, my sons. Don't be in a hurry. We will choose exactly the right minute, then I shall go out in front. When you see me raise my hand, look to it that you have your bayonets sharp and fixed, and come out after me." Meanwhile, the New Zealanders had finally been relieved by 2 battalions from Lord Kitchener's new army who had never seen action: the 6th Loyal North Lancashires and the 5th Wiltshires. On the morning of August 10th, at 4:45 a.m., Mustafa Kemal raised his hand and walked forward. His now 6 Turkish battalions charged the Lancashires and bayoneted them to the man. And in an incredible stroke of bad luck for the British, the Wiltshires below had just put down their rifles to rest and could only helplessly run away. So the Turks charged down the slope, hoping to force the Allies completely from the hill. But New Zealand machine gunners on the next spur opened fire and stopped the Turkish left flank. The right flank reached a plateau called the Farm, where they met the 38th Brigade. Hand-in-hand fighting broke out, and after half of the brigade had been killed or wounded, including Brigadier General A.H. Baldwin, The survivors on both sides fell back. The British further downhill, the Turks up on the ridge. Once again, Çanakkale was in Turkish hands. The Allied lines were further inland than before, yes, but still stuck on the western side of the peninsula. Just think, for a short while, those New Zealander troops that had held the top of Çanakkale could actually see the waters of the Narrows shimmering and glistening below them. Target, the main goal. Perhaps one day they'd see them again. At Suvla Bay, where British troops had successfully landed last week, there were several days of fighting early this week. In fact, 25 British battalions were ashore by the 7th, and German Admiral von Tirpitz wrote this day in his diary. Heavy fighting has been going on since yesterday at the Dardanelles. The situation is obviously critical. Should the Dardanelles fall, the World War has been decided against us. Now, as we saw last week, the troops that landed didn't advance across the coastal plain towards Aki Baba, and this hesitation would prove disastrous over the next few days. British official historian Brigadier General Aspinall Oglander, there's a mouthful, was harsh on them. Quote, "By the hesitation and delay of the 7th and 8th of August, the advantages gained by the surprise landing at Suvla had all been thrown away. It was now to be a fight between forces of equal numbers, with the British troops in the open, and the Turks in possession of every point of vantage. Once surprise had gone, there was little chance with anything approaching equal numbers of scoring a British success." End quote. He also noted that the British battalions were new army troops straight out of England, and the Turks were experienced and far superior to them. So, for the total 4 days of battle for Suvla Bay, Çanakkale, 50,000 British and Anzac troops had fought, with 10,000 killed and 2,000 wounded. But more than 20,000 sick and wounded men were taken from Gallipoli to hospitals in either Egypt or Malta. By the end of the week, the hospitals were full. And completely failing to learn from their earlier mistake, when the assault was renewed the 13th, the troops again advanced from Suvla Bay, stopped, and dug a line of trenches when they reached Anafarta Ridge. Even though there were no Turks or Turkish trenches anywhere in sight, they could have continued a lot further and captured high ground. Within 24 hours, the Turkish 5th Division had driven them back toward the bay. Also on the 13th, the Allied troop transport, the Royal Edward, all 11,000 tons of her, was sunk by a German sub off the island of Kos. 1,865 soldiers drowned. And we come to the end of the week. The German and Austrian forces linking up in a solid line that spells trouble for the Russians. The Russians under siege in Kovno and Novogeorgievsk. The Germans failing in the Argonne and the Allies failing at Gallipoli. For you can't call it anything but a failure. Taking a few dozen meters of new ground isn't a success when you have entire battalions being basically wiped out. I can understand that those New Zealander troops holding Çanakkale desperately needed relief, and the Lancashires and Wiltshires may have been the only troops available, but those men, those raw recruits who'd never seen combat, were simply sent to the slaughter. I don't think there's any strategy that can justify that, but 2020 hindsight is easy, but 2020 foresight is absolutely impossible in modern war. And in the end, there were many people who said beforehand that taking the Dardanelles is impossible. Even Winston Churchill, who came up with the plan in late 1914, had said so a few years earlier. Still, they tried.